Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Professor Moab has just told us what the impacts of climate change are going to be. I'd like to make this more concrete, looking at Africa. Africa, as we've heard right from the Mexican ambassador, the Peruvian ambassador, saying that Africa is the most vulnerable continent, and yet it is the least emitter. I was a lead author from the IPCC, Working Group 2, Chapter 13, just to give you my identity. Now, when we talk about risk in climate change, what are we talking about? Climate-related risks come from hazards interacting with the vulnerability of exposed societies, communities, and ecological systems. Now, you find that the vulnerability of societies, communities, and ecological systems in Africa usually are undergoing certain changes. There are always changes. There are changes in the socio-economic, there are changes in the political, there are changes in the ecological systems. What do we mean by this? In Africa, there's been increasing, for example, socio-economic inequalities. And how this is going to interact with climate change, or rather is already interacting with climate change, has implications. For example, you find that these changes that are taking place at different times. Currently, Africa is one of the fastest growing continents. Out of the 10 economies growing globally, Africa is in them. So what do we mean by this? So when we talk of the aspect of risk in climate change, sometimes people tend to think that it's only risk about climate change. But there are other risks. If you live and work in an African city, like I do, there are other risks. There's the risk of epidemics. There's the risk of insecurity. There's the risk of disease. Right now, Africa, West Africa, is suffering Ebola. So when we look at climate change in Africa, we are saying that this is another new layer of risk. How can we make this risk, when we add this new layer of risk, what implications does it have when it interacts with other risks already there? So we are not saying that climate change is the only risk, but it is interacting with other risks. And as I think Dr. Zaks said, finding out which is responsible for what is very difficult. What we are trying to emphasize here is that the African economies already have multiple risks. These risks you add on climate change, but knowing which caused what is very difficult. And that's why climate change is, I think, asking us to begin to change the way we think. So whether we mitigate the risks of climate change are going to continue with increased emissions. It is being said now that the IPCC has identified certain areas for concern, and it says even at relatively low degrees, 1 to 2 degrees increase in temperature, many of the unique and natural systems will be threatened, and food productivity, human health, and water is going to be negatively impacted. When we go to the scenario of 4 degrees and above, the likelihood of severe and worse, irreversible, we are going to reach the tipping point. Have we reached the tipping point? Some parts of Africa, I believe, are reaching the tipping point, where whatever we do, whether you adapt, you are going to have zero impact. And this is what we are trying to avoid in Africa. Now, we find that Africa is already increasing in food insecurity. In 2012, the Sahel region of Africa was affected by food insecurity. A total of 13.4 million people were vulnerable. Out of these 13.4 million people, 10 million were food insecure. That is nearly all of them. And coupled with this, the children, 1 million children, were at risk of malnutrition. Africa has been fighting trying to reduce the infant mortality due to malnutrition. But this is not going to work because the threat of climate change is threatening to reverse the progress that Africa countries have made. They had made significant progresses in tackling disease, malnutrition, infant mortality. And in some African countries, there have been gains in agricultural production. But all this is going to be reversed. And we find that in African countries is where we're going to have the largest increase in temperature, more than in any other areas. And these are communities that are already vulnerable. So climate change is a threat to human security because it does undermine livelihoods. It is compromising culture and identity. Traditionally, Africa had its own systems of forecasting rainfall, but these systems have been compromised because we have a community in Kenya called the Nganyi rainmakers. And these rainmakers, usually they didn't make rain, but they predicted that this is the forecast. But because climate is so variable and changing, they would use insects, they would use the signs of certain trees, but now they can no longer do it. So communities in Africa require that we have a concerted effort. What is happening now, again, still with the rainmakers of Western Kenya, is that the Intergovernmental Authority on Climate Change, on Development, IGAD, has been working with these rainmakers. And the Intergovernmental Authority on Development produces each season. In Africa, we depend on 2 rainy seasons. So there's the March, April, May season, that is the long rain, and the September, October, November, December short rain season. So they have been working with the conventional meteorologists. And the last 5 forecasts, each produces their forecasts, independent of each other, and these forecasts have been tallying. What are we saying? We are saying, and I think the Mexican ambassador said it very clearly, if we are to make a change, we must all participate in the solution. And it is not only the conventional science, but the affected communities, all of us bringing a solution to the table. It must be inclusive and transparent. Again, climate change is going to have an impact on human health. We have a lot of diseases like malaria. Malaria is endemic in the lowlands of Africa. But now malaria in the last 20 years or so has been creeping to the highlands of Africa. And this, of course, poses challenges when given that the African health systems, the infrastructure, is not enough to cope with the normal climate variability. Now add on the impact of climate change and you have a disaster. Conflict. The African continent, if you draw a map, it is dotted with areas of conflict. And conflict makes people vulnerable. How does conflict make people vulnerable? It makes people vulnerable in that the infrastructure that makes exposed communities and societies able to withstand the shocks of climate change are usually destroyed. When it comes to livelihoods and poverty, climate change is already causing harm among rural and urban Africans living in poverty. Projections show that in 2030, about 960 million Africans will be living on less than $2 a day. The population is just about 1 billion. It means the whole of the African continent in 2013, unless we act now, is going to be more vulnerable. Now, what does poverty mean? As I said earlier, poverty is just another layer. Poverty in Africa means you will not be able to go to school, you're illiterate, your health is compromised, you might not see beyond age 5. Most poor people live in the low-income areas in Africa. And this means that they live in vulnerable conditions, in the slums, in the floodplains. That's where they can construct their houses. Within the slums or in the low-income communities, you find that even access, when there's a disaster, becomes very difficult, so that even emergency, reaching the people, takes a long time. At the same time, most of these poor people have all their life savings tied up in a bundle. When the floods come, it washes away everything. So what the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report is saying is that climate change is going to zero the poverty reduction efforts that Africa has made. And secondly, it is going to sink more people into poverty traps. Already, people are suffering. We have some direct impacts on livelihoods and poverty. This is what I was alluding to. In the low-income areas, in urban areas, because of the poor quality of housing, you find that the natural assets that is mostly being eroded is the disappearance of land. We have to remember this is against a background where most of the people are landless in the first place. And this is leading to the disappearance of land. This should actually read the indirect impacts. Then we have the indirect impacts on livelihoods and poverty. One that comes to mind is the biofuels policy. A lot of investors are seeing Africa as virgin land, seeing Africa as being that continent where we are having what we are calling the second scramble for land in Africa. There's a lot of land in Africa. That is the belief out there. Our governments are even renting out our land to other countries to produce food for their countries. And yet, Africa is food insecure. So, although biofuels you find that may harm people through declining biodiversity and reduced grazing land, a lot of the areas where the biodiversity schemes, the biofuel schemes are being implemented are usually in the pastoralist communities, where there's that mistake that there's lots and lots of land. So when the pastoralist communities, who are already vulnerable to the climate variability, you take away their grazing land and you increase their vulnerability. But at the same time, there are also gains to be made. Like employment in the biofuel industry could actually create opportunities for people to increase their incomes, which they could have lost due to the impacts of climate change on their agricultural production. So when we talk of climate change and poverty, we are talking of the inequalities that are there in society. It's not just poverty and climate change interacting, but it means that when you're poor, you are unable to make decisions about what determines your future. You do not have a voice. You are not invited to the table of negotiations. So climate change is interacting with other factors to increase the vulnerability of African populations. So what we are saying is that if we are to reduce emissions, we must also at the same time foster adaptation and mitigate the impacts. But we must also readdress the climate change poverty nexus, because this means we have to reorganize our societies, both in the North and in the South, but more particularly urgent in Africa, because the social inequalities in Africa are increasing. The gender inequalities for the ethnic minorities, for the disabled, all these impacts needs us to rethink the way we organize our societies if we're going to have an impact in mitigating against the impacts of climate change. So adaptation is already occurring in Africa. I usually say it's us, scientists, negotiators, policymakers, that are talking of climate change today. Societies have been adapting, particularly in Africa. They have had no choice. It is us who are thinking it is new, well, relatively new. So you find that adaptation is the only option. And communities, whether or not 2015 comes to a deal, communities are adapting. They have no choice. What we are saying that we need to do with the communities is that as they adapt, their ability to move out of the vulnerable situation has been compromised. Because today, we are having rapid successions of extreme events. Before, you'd be given a 7-10-year period to recover before you had the next drought. But today, the drought is recurrent. Before you have had time to recover from the last drought, you're moving on to the next one. And after the drought will usually come El Nino. Then there is a flood. So there is no time for recovery. So adaptation can bring benefits both today and in the future. And Africa has a lot to gain from adaptation actions, but we need to move away from risk reduction to actually proactively anticipating climate risk and acting in a proactive manner. We are usually given notice 6 months before, telling us that there's going to be a famine, there's going to be a drought. But nobody does anything. We all wait until the disaster happens. Then we start knee-jerk reaction. I think what we need to do in Africa is to integrate this. And although communities, we have several success stories of adaptation in Africa. Communities are adapting, but they remain pockets of success stories. What we need is at the national level, at the regional level, and at the international level to help these success stories become a regional, national, and eventually a global reality. So adaptation strategies must therefore strengthen livelihoods, enhance well-being and human security, and reduce poverty. And as I said, there are a lot of low regrets actions which are happening. And this, for example, increasing access to information and resources, the example I mentioned of the Western Kenya rainmakers, where they are working in conjunction with other conventional institutions to increase information. We have a lot of early warning systems, communities that are using early warning systems to implement, to plan their agricultural calendar. So what we are saying about adaptation in Africa, it is really about development. So the incentive for African governments should be high on the agenda. And likewise, with the donor community, they should be able to continue funding those development projects that they are funded, but with a new lens, with a climate change lens, by insisting that this money, any investment must be climate change proofed to make sure that it's not going to have a negative impact. So what we are saying is that if you're going to have effective disaster relief and recovery, we need to have proactive efforts. And this means making adaptation part and parcel of our development policies. However, we find that we have challenges to adaptation in Africa. One is lack of adequate climate data and information. We know that, for example, the weather collection stations in Africa are very few and scattered. Then we also lack information, not just on the climate risks, but also on other risks that are affecting, making people more vulnerable in Africa. And then again, another problem that we have, and this is not just specific to Africa, is that development planning usually tends to take place at the national scale, at a larger scale. And this could avoid the small, localized climate change impacts or climate variabilities. Again, climate change asks us to be more participative, to work across sectors, but our policies tend to be sector-oriented. And it's very difficult to find two parts of government knowing what the right hand doesn't often know what the left hand is doing. And yet we have to act together and across sectors. Now, what we need is that there are limits to adaptation. So mitigation in the long term is the answer. And we need global action to reduce mitigation, to reduce the emission of greenhouse gas emissions. So what we are saying, Africa is in a better position to perhaps lead the way to a low emissions development. But this, it needs support. And not just financial support, it also needs moral support. We in the global community, we all need to rethink, change the way we think if we are going to handle climate change. So to be cost-effective on a global scale, most mitigation needs to take place in those countries that are projected to have the highest emissions in the future, like the emerging economies. And of course, the developing countries, as I said, we have an opportunity in order to place ourselves as the leaders. But we can only do this if we begin to adapt and follow a low emissions pathway. Thank you.